This is a really important section. It's going to be a lot to get through. And so there is a pre-warning that we do for every class when we talk about this, or when I talk about it. When you guys read information in the text and the language that I'm going to be using, just so that you know. Of course, take a break if it's too much, but I think that the information obviously is very important, and then we get to know language, terms, laws, policies, and a general outline of what gender-based violence is. So here are some resources as well on organizations and groups that have been doing some great work in this area in terms of research, but also working directly with victims, but also working on the policy level, but predominantly a lot of research level, just to see who the players are and what's happening. So these are a lot of the topics that are covered in the chapter, and it's quite a bit. So I'll try to get through it as much as I can. So the book provides a scenario about a young woman in college, and I hope you guys get a chance to read it. I'll leave it here for a minute for you to read, and then we'll go into it. Okay, so we see from the beginning of this relationship to how it begins to escalate in terms of a female and a male dating, and we see the behaviors that start giving us warning signs and what's happening. Obviously, it's a fictional scenario, but some of you may know, and I know that this has happened personally to people that I've known. And so even though this particular story is fictional, there are probably some elements to it that are very familiar to all of us in some aspect. Either if it's not personal, then with family or friends, definitely somebody we know. But this is the introduction we start with on intimate partner violence. There are two more scenarios. I'll have give you guys some time to read this as well. So the second scenario, of course, is with a gay couple, and the third scenario is with a young woman who is forced or being forced into an arranged marriage. And all three of these scenarios, given that they're all different, they involve gender-based violence, and which is defined as violence or a threat of violence directed at an individual because of that person's gender, often because of perceived gender nonconformity. So what does that mean, right? It's failing to meet the expectations of gendered appearance and behavior, and there's the means to subordinate that. Here we have our definition. So this brings in our notions of masculinity, femininity, heteronormativity, if you remember those terms, and they all intersect and contribute to gender-based violence. And other forms of violence include, there's a breakdown that will go into intimate partner violence, sexual violence, stalking, and violence against people in the LGBTQ communities, QIA communities. And folks are redefining gender-based. You may have seen in the last couple weeks, especially if you watch the symposium on missing and murdered Indigenous women, there is a law called VAWA, the Violence Against Women Act. And so in the book, it starts explaining the differences in what they see between violence against women versus gender-based. Of course, we know that violence against women with that language is directly at a particular group that we think of, right? It's usually women in itself, or particularly heterosexual. We don't see all the elements that will intersect with that. So in this particular section, we use the general term gender-based violence because it is more inclusive, and there's a lot more intersects that cut across this than just violence against women. And so we have here violence directed at women because she is a woman is better defined as sex-based violence. That's another term instead of just using violence against women. So we have to be mindful in anything that we do about our language and our communication. And here's the definition for terms, the problems with it. Too narrow, not broad enough, and it contributes to the misunderstanding of gender, conflating it with sex, right? How much have we learned about the differences between our gender, our sex, our femininity, masculinity, all of these different terms, gender-based, right? And gender-based as a term is a better descriptor because it allows us to see the links and broader forms of violence. And gender-based suggests a more complex idea that violence directed at women, men, and people of other sexes and gender identities is sometimes bounded up with the ways that gender is socially constructed. That such violence is both the result of hierarchical conceptions of gender and the way of reinforcing those concepts. And there are various forms, as I had mentioned in the beginning. So just to recap, there is IPV, which I use a lot for short-term but intimate partner violence. There's rape, there's female infanticide, dowry-related violence, and honor crimes. So these are just a few of them that are mentioned across the board. And when we look at gender-based violence directed at women, we have to be mindful that it's part of a larger system that creates and maintains unequal gender power relations on individual and societal levels. So they're motivated, these crimes, the violence is motivated by desire for power and control. And we also have other items of what it's influenced by. So we have things like race, ethnicity, class, migrant or refugee status, your age, religion, sexual orientation, marital status, if you're able or disabled, HIV status, and or other factors. And the most obvious examples of gender-based violence not directed at women are at gay and bisexual men and transgender or third sex, third gender person. And in the US, we identify such violence as bias or hate crimes, also part of the systems of heteronormativity. And what was heteronormativity? The idea that same sex is wrong and there's a rightness of heterosexuality. And so if you think, or if you come from that perspective, there is also this idea of punishing those that don't conform to gender. And there's enforced subordination when that comes with gender-based violence. So we have anti-LGBTQIA, women and women wartime when this takes helm and control. Also, it gives examples of African American men who were targeted for lynching by whites, can also be understood as victims of gender-based violence. In addition to this, besides the race, there was intersections of gender and, or besides race, that lynching graphically demonstrated their vulnerability and debasement. So I'm not sure if you've read about this time or seen images, but there is a lot of mutilation to the bodies as well, and sexual mutilation to the bodies when there were lynchings, especially at the height of their times. And so we have here that the purpose was often to terrorize, to emasculate, and to demonstrate white men's intention to occupy the loftiest position in the racial and gendered hierarchy. So these are some cases when we look at punishing gender nonconformity and enforcing subordination. Let's see. The book was also pointing out to be mindful that how we categorize hate crimes, other crimes, and what is considered gender-based and what wouldn't be. And there's research for that as well. But in this scenario, it gives an example of a minor traffic accident where there's a guy who is straight and another guy who is gay, but they're unaware of each other's sexuality. And so they get into a fight. Is this gender-based? No. Obviously no, but if there was any other contexts or situations, we'd have to look at that. But them not being aware of each other's sexuality, the man hit the gay man. This is not an instance of being hit just because he is gay. It is other incidences, and it goes into details. But there's some scenarios that they also give of what would be considered gendered based. So intimate partner violence, here are the several forms, but let's look at the definition. Intimate partner violence is the physical, sexual, or psychological harm, including threats of physical or sexual violence by a current or former partner or spouse. And it's the most common form, or the most common format of intimate partner violence is the interpersonal violence globally. IPV is now the most commonly used term, intimate partner violence, and replaced domestic violence or wife battering. IPV is a more inclusive term, similar to gender-based violence. So let's look at intimate partner violence globally. Challenges. There's a little cross-cultural research. There's still a lot more work being done. And where there is research, making comparisons between studies, because it becomes difficult to analyze the data because of the way that it's being collected and the different methods that are being used to study it. We also have some highlighted points. There are varying rates of prevalence in different locations around the world, but what they found is that there is a lot of high rates in rural settings. There are a number of reasons for that in terms of not close to policing centers or other social services, or just like around, in general, other people. So there's not a lot of help in some instances where folks can get help readily or quickly. Also, men are more controlling, were also more likely to be violent. Intimate partner violence was reported predominantly unidirectional, which means that is men against women. And women were victimized at higher rates where women had less power or lower power status. The converse was also true and found that across countries and states and cultures, women's empowerment is associated with lower victimized rates from partners. So the more empowerment, the more independence and other aspects of society that women's places and roles, there were lower victimizations. In countries where women's empowerment was low, people tended to show considerable approval of quote-unquote wife beating. It shows the important role that culture and societal norms shows the important role that these norms play in supporting or discouraging intimate partner violence against women. Here's a few other stats. I'm going to leave this for you to get into more, but there is a significant difference when we look globally at the global north versus the global south in terms of IPV rates. But here's some from U.S. General Western. So 22 to 42% of couples in the U.S. experience intimate partner violence. In the West, women are more likely to suffer. And the negative consequences that result are things like women are more likely to be injured and go to the emergency rooms. Women report higher incidences of fear and depression and greater economic loss. Women with fewest resources and women who battle discrimination are particularly vulnerable. Men commit more sexual violence and stalking in intimate relationships. So the most common type of intimate partner violence in the U.S. compared to other Western countries is bidirectional violence, which is that both partners are violent toward each other. So where do folks get the data? It's for a combination of places, and we have a few examples here from sociology, crime records, public health, and looking at different population segments, and also research tools. So this, if you're not, or if you've taken any other sociology courses, we have family conflict studies, and they look at a broad range of physical aggressive behaviors. They'll look anywhere from very minor to severe. But also these acts, I think this is important to know, that They do not need to reach the level of crime to be included in these studies, versus another one, which they predominantly just look at the crime documented. Also, we have the use of the family conflict tactic scale to measure. And some of the negative things is that from using this is that it doesn't tell researchers the motivations of the perpetrators, it doesn't reveal who initiated the violence, and it doesn't measure the impact. So in terms of what we had mentioned before, like the type of incidences or the type of injuries and how severe they may have been. So the other tool besides family conflict studies is we have victimization and crime studies. So here we have things like police reports and actual surveys of respondents as a crime, but they do produce lower numbers. And what are those reasons? We know that not many people will report to the police or other authorities for a wide variety of reasons, but we'll go into that a little bit more later. But here are some few things to keep mindful of why it produces lower numbers. So these capture predominantly more severe violence, as well as males being predominantly more of the perpetrators of severe violence against females, and men may be less likely to view an assault by a woman because if they're bi-directional, they're not going to report the assault by a woman or figure it needs to be reported as a crime. And there's a variety of reasons for that as well. When we look at what's masculinity, being feared of, being thought of as something weaker or less than, these ideas of masculinity. So there's going to be a lot less men who report the other way around. Also, men's self-reporting may be suppressed with studies that are labeled as violence against women. So this, again, idea of what masculinity, femininity behaviors. So these two types can yield what seems like conflicting results and comparisons. They can be challenging, but it's what's being used. And there's some strides where they're trying to make a difference in that. Okay, so how do they look at data in terms of the types of violence? So here are the breakdowns or the forms of intimate partner violence that goes even further. We have intimate terrorism, violence resistance, and situational couple violence. And terrorism, we're looking at the systematic in nature. They escalate in frequency and the severity over time, and often unidirectional, so one way, usually predominantly male over female, and exerting power and control, and is thought to make up a relatively small proportion of intimate partner violence. Violence resistance. Victims, often women, retaliate with violence. So this is where we introduce the terms bidirectional violence as well. Individual resisting is violent but not controlling and is faced with a partner who's both violent and controlling. Situational couple violence, most common form of IPV. Men and women equally perpetrate. Occasional violence escalation is the exception rather than the rule. We have some risk factors. Some of them you might already be aware of, but we're going to go ahead and cover what's been found in research and in studies. There is obviously multiple factors that go into risk factors, but a few of them are patriarchal beliefs. Remember that term from earlier in the beginning of the semester. So the idea of the father factor, or the man having control over the home and the house and the work and that structural system may be a contributing factor for some male perpetrated. Also, you have holding pro-violent attitudes, which puts people more at risk. And growing up in a violent home, there are certain personality traits such as dependency or jealousy or personality disorders, also known as generally aggressive personality. More risk factors of unemployment, low socioeconomic status, youth under the age of 30, younger folks, and being in a dating or cohabitating relationship, which was what as opposed to being married. This is what There's some discrepancies in this within the book, but just to be aware of some general risk factors in terms of what they found in their research. Okay, so keeping in mind that intimate partner violence cuts across lines. It cuts across racial, ethnic, national, religious, socioeconomic status, sexual orientation, gender identity, and others. Even though we have risk factors, of course, there's not just one particular group or person that it affects. It's across lines. What to know about samples and research from minority communities. So here are some additional findings. That we have people of color that are overrepresented, and this is an issue with studies and findings in general, because population-wise, yes, more people of color self-identified in census and other birthing rates, they're increasing more for people of color, but that's still a small part of many samples and research. And so we have to keep mindful of certain data and research and how people do that, or who they include. I always think of polls and surveys, and I'm thinking, who did they survey? Where were they polled? How many people in this? So we always have to be mindful of the research. But what they did find in some of these smaller studies, and where they found people of color overrepresented, people of color and those with lower socioeconomic status suffered disproportionately from negative social forces. So this is the intersectionality, again, of racism, classism, sexism, and other forms of discrimination, not only by individuals, but institutionally and systemically. Other risk factors, again, include societal forces of what we mentioned here. And there are differences in rates of intimate partner violence among different racial and ethnic groups, or differences in rates of IPV among different racial and ethnic groups become much less pronounced. That's a really great point. So we can see how different that is. And the point that they were trying to make with the systemic structures in looking at this, it's more complicated than just blaming an individual or individuals. It's rather larger when we take into account all these other societal factors. And some suggestions for broad-based, or for solutions, is broad-based programs. And you can't, come up with one strategy to fit all. I think that's in any case of learning and education and coming up with solutions and ideas, that they have to be pretty broad and try to address as many challenges in communities as you can. A big underlying factor, of course, is addressing economic issues. And this will particularly help survivors leave violent relationships. In addition to, because they're the majority of the receiving end of being the victims. But when we know that women are more economically empowered and not as dependent, they are more likely to leave their abusers. We have some instances with our same-sex community where there are some increases. Certain folks within the LGBTQ community will experience higher rates of intimate partner violence. And there's, again, similarly is largely attributed to stresses and results of societal forces. In this case, discrimination and homophobia, and may be combined with racism and classism for gay people of color and gay working class people. We have other increases with same-sex partners and relationships. Isolation and helplessness may be exacerbated within the LGBTQ community. It is more difficult to report. There's fear of seeking help from the legal systems because they have fewer rights and experience discrimination by police and healthcare workers more often. There's also a threat of being outed by the perpetrator who is committing the violence. All right, let's look at feminism, activism, and intimate partner violence. Obviously, where we are today isn't where we were, say, 40 years ago or even 10 years ago. There's changes constantly being made by a wide variety of people to improve these situations. And so 40 years ago, the term itself, intimate partner violence, really started being used more formally of what we, and so, wait, I'm sorry. I'm getting myself confused. So prior to the term intimate partner violence, we actually had the other uses of wife beating or domestic violence, but as we know, language and communication has changed dramatically over that time. And so what we know today as intimate partner violence really back then was seen more as a private issue. It was also ignored by police, and services for survivors were non-existent. And there was little known about the scope or dynamics because no one really started doing research at the time about it. There was some, but it was very limited. And we have the role of feminists, people who started to help change the narrative. So one of those aspects was making it very personal and bringing it out of the private realm and having public conversations. And so the idea of the personal is political, and it was pushed issues into the public view. And so we see it as a tool used by men to assert and maintain power and control over women. This was the idea that started growing more in definition. And we also had feminists refuted the 1950s ideas and psychology, remembering where women, especially white women versus women of color, where they were in their workforces, where they were with their families, and who was at the center during that time. But you had feminists that were refuting these general ideas and refuted that women who stay in abusive relationships were passive or masochistic. This is what they were saying about women at the time, and feminists were saying, no, that's not what it is. And really, it was a tool by men to assert and maintain power and control over women. Early work focused on unidirectional violence perpetrated by men and direct to the women, remembering that term. Women sustained more injuries and more serious injuries as well, and more consequences. Today, no one theory can account for all intimate partner violence, and women are still being disproportionately negatively affected by such violence. So how were women advocating for change? Here are some direct areas of activism. Definitely one of them was legal and through services and providing services. And obviously there are still challenges that still remain today, but we look at lack of affordable and safe housing as one of those areas. More than a quarter of the families in homeless shelters cite abuse as a cause for their staying. The need for economically focused programs such as job training and employment assistance. And this goes back again to the idea of women that are more economically independent. Shows and studies that they are more likely to leave an abusive relationship. Not all the time, but they are more likely. Feminists have been instrumental in key legislative victories. So we had the Violence Against Women. There were 2 points that it was reauthorized, 1994, 2013, and actually just this year recently in 2019, about a month ago. All right. Actually, I have to look at that. It might have passed the House, but I don't think it's passed the Senate. So we're going to have to see where that is. Because a lot of things these days with policies is just not making it through both houses. All right. So we have, what did VAWA bring? It brought police, prosecutors, and courts to a place where their people could be better trained. It expanded protections for Native American and LGBTQ people. And this part I'll get into a little bit more, but if you listen to the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Symposium, there's a lot of talk about tribal law, federal law, state law, and jurisdiction issues that come under a complete different house when related to these type of crimes. It strengthened courts, improved services, housing, safety protection, and trafficked immigrants. In the 13th provision, this is where we had greater tribal authority that was provided for courts and tribal nations, and it had the power to prosecute non-natives. So this was a really big factor in all across the U.S. because non-native perpetrators were committing acts at high rates against Native women and were not being held accountable for it. But now, and this goes way back, the history behind this goes back to the founding of the country and the Supreme Court, and I mean, it's layers and layers of the way the country was set up and founded, and having tribes be a part of those new systems, right? We also have the new provisions for this year, which is dealing with gun safety and gun checks. There are challenges, questions the use of mandatory arrest policies. So who and then would be arrested in these crimes? So there are folks that argue that it disempowers survivors and discourages reporting when you have folks being arrested. The wrong folks, some people might argue, being arrested. Victims are reluctant to have perpetrators arrested and lead to job loss and economic hardship. So either from the victim side or even the perpetrator side, there's questions about mandatory arrest policies because obviously you're dealing with a lot of family complicated issues, and it's going to be by someone that they know, especially if it's coming down to a husband or a boyfriend or someone in that mix. And so you get all kinds of complicated in there. Oh yes, that's a good point. Sorry, I was going back and forth. Is given that if the perpetrator is male, most likely in this scenario, and the woman is the victim, and if she does not have the economic independence and is depending on her boyfriend or husband or whoever the perpetrator is at this point, that's going to be seen as an economic hardship and loss, especially if they lose their job or anything related to that. And so they don't want them to get arrested. And how are other women, oh, there's 2 slides, that's why. All right. So solutions, we're looking at best approaches, also broad-based is good, and the best approaches extend beyond the criminal justice system. So some of those things we're looking at of addressing, right? Safe, affordable housing is one of the big factors in helping women transition and be more economically sufficient, as well as a lot of other social programming when it comes to food, and if there's children involved, support systems that are all related to that. All right, so let's look at sexual violence. So we know it's a global phenomenon. Majority are females and and third-gendered people, and there are lower rates in the numbers of males. Over half of the female victims and a third male victims report being raped by intimate partners. So sexual violence within intimate partner relationships, or intimate partner violence in general. Sexual violence knows no boundaries. Rape is probably universal across societies, but frequency will vary. And I'll get into that a little bit more when we look at some of the studies within smaller societies that was done by researchers and communities. High quality research is rare. Rape is thought of to be one of the most underreported crimes. In the US, it's thought to be anywhere from 64 to 96% of all rapes are never reported to the police. Millions are subject to sexual violence each year. The chances of women being raped in the US is 1 in 6 and 1 in 8, and 1 in 74 for men. You can see that discrepancy. Although these numbers will change, depending also on race, ethnicity, and other class groups and other intersections. In general, during this time frame of the book when it was published, it had these numbers. 14.6 million women and 1.6 million men live with the consequences of rape. and they're saying that this is a conservative number. So what do we know about rape? So here are some common spotlights to keep in mind, that rape is overwhelmingly committed by males against females, and the age group that tends to be most reported is between ages of 16 and 24 years old, women that are between that age. The majority of rapes are committed by acquaintances, so the women know their assailants. Intimate partners typically involve no weapons in terms of what they found in their research, and it is not typical that these crimes are promptly reported to the police. Most are never reported. Rape by known assailants is least likely to result in conviction, and we covered that a little bit earlier for a wide variety of reasons. We have young men overrepresented, and of those charged and convicted, paralleling other violent crimes. So there's other aspects of the crime that are incorporated into these charges. Most rape is intraracial, meaning that it involves two people of the same race. So those are some other factors that should be also remembered. LGBTQ community also have higher rates. We have other factors, that people with disabilities, we have folks that are prison inmates, and the homeless are victims in sexualized violence at higher rates than the general population. We have undocumented immigrants that are also vulnerable. And this was what I was talking about earlier, about the researchers and how they study rapes and why. So like many other aspects, there's a lot of complexity and diversity, and this is one aspect from one researcher, Brenner in this particular case, and then Turchik and Wilson. But the reason one perpetrator rapes a stranger is fundamentally distinct from the reason a perpetrator rapes in the commission of another crime. A battery rapes his or her intimate partner, and the person rapes an acquaintance in a quasi-romantic setting. So basically, this sounds a bit confusing, but there is a difference between a stranger versus someone that is known. Research examines two different populations. They looked at incarcerated rapists and those that are not incarcerated. Majority of these were young men, often college students. So they looked at these two different groups, and they found some similarities between these two groups, or at least they called them undetected rapists, those who admitted to the behavior or attempted but were not arrested. And this is what they found in their this is what they found. High levels of anger at women. There's a strong need to dominate women. Hypermasculinity. High levels of hypermasculinity. And as a reminder of what that is, it often includes stereotypical endorsement of gender roles, high value placed on control, power, competition, toleration of pain, and mandatory heterosexuality. Lack of empathy, psychopathy, and antisocial traits. Incarcerated and undetected rapists hold more pro-rape attitudes and associate sexual activity with domination. There's one study where among male college students, a small portion of men may be responsible for a large number of rapes. This was looking on one college campus. 6.4% of college men admitted to committing rape or attempted rape. Of this, 2/3 or 63% were repeat offenders who committed nearly 6 rapes each. This comes from the research of Lisak and Miller, and can also be found more depth on page 267 in the text. So one question that they had, of course, were these for the non-incarcerated or undetected rapists is how do they escape arrest? Most attacked within their social groups and left no physical injuries. Many rape cases, they seem quote unquote difficult to prove and might not actually be of peers within the perpetrator's social network, and former intimate partners are questioned. I'm sorry, that may have sound confusing, but so they're saying that in many of these cases, it seems that they're difficult to prove, but they really shouldn't be if they looked more deeply into the peers and social structures and looked at former partners in their line of questioning, and they didn't do that in many of these cases. So what are some things that folks are working on in terms of trying to bring some resolution, even if it's a bit? We're looking at debunking rape myths. So having everybody understand what these myths are and just not believing them and changing the narrative from these. We have things like only bad girls get raped. Only healthy women can resist a rapist if she wants to. Women ask for it. Women lie about rape. Rapists are sex-starved, insane, or both. And these are all myths, major myths, that hurt and still are real prevalent today in terms of having victims and perpetrators being held responsible and victims being believed. So beliefs about rape and sexual assault, the predominant narrative still is to blame the victim. And why do we do that? Why does society blame the victim? It justifies the perpetrator's actions, discount the rape as violent, seek to deflect attention from the act of rape to actions on the female rape survivor, to the actions. Okay. So what else does these beliefs do? They also are so powerful and pervasive, these ideas, these myths, that they really do reflect and shape how society thinks about violence, sexual violence particularly. And it's harmful in many ways. But of course, other ways that it's harmful is that when it comes into court or jury, media, and we've probably seen this countless times in the last several years. I would say more so politically on that realm, but I think all across the board when we look at sexual violence. They counter basic facts and yet persist, affecting media coverage of sexual violence, a jury's decision to convict an accused rapist, to a survivor's self-perception. These are all the ways that these myths blame the victim and are pervasive. There's this idea of physical resisting, and that if one is not resisting enough or at all, it goes back again into the victim blaming. There are also this idea of false reports, and this is not true. It is not a widespread problem. A lot of people think that it is, but it's not. And so I'm looking at all of these rapes and the beliefs about victim blaming. Why is this important? I have to strongly stress it's important and it's problematic because they distort the truth. And we have to be better at getting at the truth. And this goes not only just in general in our society, but when we start leaping into the area of sexual assault on campus, it's just as important. Because from what we've seen over the last couple of years, obviously there is a serious problem on college campuses. These are a little bit older stats, but they're still relatively within the same quadrant. 1 in 5 women are attacked or at least has experienced sexual assault, and 1 in 17 men. and this is while they're in college. Sexual assault includes a broader range of acts, more than just rape. So there are things like consensual, non-consensual kissing or groping. Most victims are assaulted by men they know or trust. The majority of sexual assaults occur when women are incapacitated. So under the influence of something, majority of it will be primarily alcohol. And in the book, he gives a scenario of what happened with Margot J. May in May of 2006 in Indiana University. And so this student, the male student, was accused of rape and found responsible for non-consensual sexual contact by a university panel, which recommended suspension for a single summer semester. The victim, Margot, was stunned by the light punishment, and she feared seeing her assailant around campus. The male eventually received more punishment, which was an additional 2 semesters suspension, but only after Margot decided to transfer to another university. There's a lot more into the story, but these are the highlighted points that I picked out. And so looking at this case, basically it was saying the outcome isn't unusual in terms of what would happen. Students deemed responsible for sexual assault on campuses faced little or no consequences for their actions. What they also found in the work is that from the U.S. Department of Justice Office of Violence Against Women, colleges expel only 10 to 25% of such men. And most disciplinary actions taken by schools from the DOJ database involves only minor sanctions, ranging from social probation, so that's just removed from campus for social activities, to academic penalties. Department of Justice encourages appropriate sanctions, such criminal law expulsion, or such as expulsion. In contrast, survivors experience depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, sleep disorder, and many other conditions, and many will leave before graduation. And so this is what they found in this one scenario on college campuses. So what are some of the policies that have been put in place at colleges and universities and in general, I would have to say? We have the Campus Sexual Violence Elimination Act that was part of VAWA in 2013. And it affirms schools are responsible for preventing, not just reporting on the assault. We have the Jean Cleary Act from 1990. And so this required schools to disclose information about crime, including sexual assault on and around on the campuses. Under the Obama administration, there were initiatives to aid colleges in responding to campus sexual violence and provided greater transparency. Many of you may have seen, hopefully around campus already, been introduced to Title IV, the federal civil rights legislation. Okay, so I wanted to make sure that we had Title IV as part of the policies, and it's part of the Higher Education Act of 1965. And what it does, or what it is it's federal civil rights legislation that prohibits sexual discrimination in education and stipulates that schools must meet 3 requirements if they find sexual assault has occurred. So 1, it's trying to end the hostile environment, or they encourage the school to end the hostile environment, prevent future occurrences, and restore victims' lives. And if schools fail to meet these standards, they can be denied federal funding. We also have another policy from 2014 coming out of California and New York, and they were the first states that instituted yes means yes legislation. I'm sure you're more familiar with the no means no, but there are several reasons why there's a shift in language. 1, though, there's a change to the criminal law. So in California law, it requires colleges in the state that receive state money to change the definition of consent in their sexual assault policies. So replacing the traditional, old school, no means no, with the standard of affirmative consent or yes means yes. This act is supposed to shift the burden to the student initiating sex to obtain a yes from the prospective partner. The law defines consent as affirmative, conscious, and voluntary agreement to engage in sexual activity. Consent need not be spoken. The new standard may not convince young men intent on getting their way to back down, but it could improve how colleges handle sexual assault allegations. I'm not sure where we are on this law, but it'd be interesting to see where the research is now. Let me take a break here, and I will come back with sexual violence by women.